Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. This happened a few years ago, but it still keeps me up at night. I was 23, fresh out of college, and my buddies and I thought it'd be cool to do a camping trip before everyone started getting too busy with jobs and adulting. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Nate, his girlfriend Claire, her cousin Sam, and our friend Jared. We decided to head out to Mendocino National Forest, a little over 3 hours from the Bay Area. It was supposed to be a chill trip, just hiking, campfires, and some cheap whiskey Nate insisted on bringing. None of us were hardcore outdoorsy types, but we weren't completely clueless either. We packed enough supplies, had a map, and Nate even brought bear spray, though we laughed about it at the time. The plan was simple: hike about 6 miles to a secluded campsite by the lake, set up for a couple of nights, and just enjoy being disconnected. The first few hours were perfect: clear skies, great views, and no cell service to distract us. We cracked jokes, took photos, and stopped to snack by the trail. But somewhere around mile 4, things got weird. It started with Sam. He was the youngest of the group, about 19, and not super experienced in the outdoors. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring into the trees on our right. "You guys see that?" he whispered. We all turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just dense forest, tall pines, and shadows. "See what?" Nate asked, rolling his eyes. Sam hesitated. "I don't know. Thought I saw someone standing there." Claire laughed nervously. "Maybe it's Bigfoot." We all chuckled, but I could see Sam wasn't joking. He kept glancing over his shoulder as we continued. I figured he was just spooked. Probably saw a shadow or something. But then, about half a mile later, Jared spoke up. "Okay, not to freak anyone out," he said, "but I swear, I just saw a dude in the trees back there." "Wait, what?" I stopped, feeling my stomach tighten. "Yeah, like a guy. He was just standing there, kinda half behind a tree, watching us." "Dude, don't mess with us," Nate said, though he didn't sound so sure. "I'm serious, man," Jared insisted. He was wearing a dark hoodie or jacket, looked scruffy. I only saw him for a second, and then he ducked behind the tree. We all stood there for a minute, scanning the woods. It was quiet. Too quiet. No birds. No wind. Just nothing. "I don't see anything," Claire said, but her voice was shaky. "Maybe we should pick up the pace," I suggested, trying to sound calm. We kept walking, but the vibe had totally shifted. Nobody was laughing or joking anymore. Every little noise, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, made us jump. I started to feel like we were being watched, even though I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. Then, about half a mile from the campsite, we all heard it. A rustling sound coming from the trees to our left. It wasn't an animal. Too heavy, too deliberate. It sounded like someone walking parallel to us, just out of sight. "Okay, what the actual hell?" Claire hissed. "Let's keep moving," Nate said firmly. We practically power walked the rest of the way, all of us hyper aware of every sound. When we finally reached the campsite, we all breathed a sigh of relief. It was a small clearing by the lake, surrounded by trees, with a fire pit someone had built from stones. "Let's just set up and chill for a bit," Nate said, trying to lighten the mood. We pitched our tents quickly, all of us sticking close together. Nobody wanted to wander off to collect firewood, so we just used what was nearby. By the time we got the fire going, it was dark, and the woods felt even more ominous. "I'm telling you, I saw someone," Jared said again, poking at the fire with a stick. "Me too," Sam added. "Maybe it's a hiker," Claire suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "Yeah, a hiker who follows people and hides in the trees," Jared muttered. "Totally normal." We all sat there in uneasy silence, listening to the crackling fire and the occasional splash of water from the lake. Every now and then, someone would shine their flashlight into the woods, but we didn't see anything. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. None of us admitted we were scared, but I could tell nobody wanted to be the first to fall asleep. Nate and Claire shared one tent, Sam and Jared shared another, and I had my own. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling, every little noise outside making my heart race. I told myself it was just animals, that there was no reason to freak out. But then, around 2 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining it. You know how your mind plays tricks on you when you're scared? But no, it wasn't my imagination. The footsteps were real. Slow, deliberate, crunching the dry leaves outside my tent. I froze, holding my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then a low scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. I wanted to yell, to wake up the others, but I couldn't make myself move. I just lay there, gripping my flashlight like it was a weapon. The footsteps started again, this time circling the tents. Whoever it was wasn't in a rush. They were taking their time, making sure we knew they were there. I finally managed to whisper, "Nate." My voice was barely audible. No response. "Nate." I tried again, louder this time. "What?" I heard him whisper back from his tent. "Did you hear that?" He didn't answer right away, but then I heard him whisper to Claire, "Stay here." A second later, his tent zipper started to open. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Nate stuck his head out of his tent, shining his flashlight into the darkness. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. "You're trespassing," he said, trying to sound tough. "We're armed." That was a lie, of course. All we had was his stupid bear spray and a couple of pocket knives. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just as Nate was about to crawl back into his tent, there was a loud crash, like someone had thrown a rock at a tree. "Okay, what the hell?" he muttered, pulling the tent zipper shut. "Guys, I think we should leave," Jared called out from his tent. "Like, right now." "We're not hiking out in the dark," Nate said. "It's probably just some weirdo trying to mess with us. If we stick together, we'll be fine." None of us liked that answer, but he was right about one thing. We couldn't hike out in the middle of the night. The trail was rough enough in daylight, and the last thing we needed was to get lost. Reluctantly, we all settled back into our tents, though I doubt any of us actually slept. Every little noise outside had me gripping my flashlight and holding my breath. But somehow the rest of the night passed without incident. By morning, it almost felt like we'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. We spent most of the next day debating whether to cut the trip short. Claire and Jared wanted to leave, but Nate insisted we stay. "If we leave now, whoever it was wins," he said, like this was some kind of competition. In the end, we decided to stay one more night, but we agreed to stick together and keep the fire burning all night. We spent the day gathering wood, making sure we had plenty to last until morning. That evening, we cooked some hot dogs over the fire, trying to lighten the mood. For a while, it worked. We started joking around again, almost convincing ourselves that we'd just overreacted the night before. And as the sun started to set, the unease crept back in. We all kept glancing over our shoulders, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. "Maybe it was just an animal," Sam said hopefully. "Yeah, an animal with shoes," Jared replied, rolling his eyes. We stayed up late, talking and trying to keep the mood light. But by midnight, the exhaustion hit. Despite our earlier plan to keep the fire going, nobody wanted to stay up alone. We doused the fire and retreated to our tents, agreeing to keep our flashlights and bear spray within reach. I lay there staring at the tent ceiling again, every noise outside making me jump. Around 2 a.m., it happened. A loud thump against my tent. I bolted upright, heart racing. For a second, I thought maybe a branch had fallen. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing, slow, heavy, just outside the tent. "Nate!" I shouted, fumbling for my flashlight. Before he could respond, the tent fabric ripped open and a hand reached inside, grabbing at me. I screamed louder than I ever have in my life, swinging the flashlight wildly at the hand. It was rough and dirty, with long fingers gripping for anything it could reach. I managed to hit it hard enough that the person yanked it back, but the next thing I heard was worse. The distinct shh of a blade being drawn across the nylon of my tent. "Nate, he's got a knife!" I yelled, scrambling backward until my head hit the back of the tent. "Get off him!" I heard Nate shout, followed by the sound of his tent unzipping. The man slashed at my tent again, the blade ripping through the fabric like paper. I could see his outline now, a tall, scruffy figure, silhouetted by Nate's flashlight beam. "Hey, back off!" Nate yelled, charging at him with the bear spray. He unleashed it in a wide arc, and the man staggered back, coughing and swearing. "Get to the fire pit," Nate shouted at me. I didn't need to be told twice. I crawled out of the shredded tent and ran toward the center of the campsite, where Claire and Jared were already huddled, clutching their flashlights. Sam was there too, his face pale as a ghost. "Who is he?" Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Nate said, keeping his flashlight trained on the man, who was retreating into the shadows. For a moment it seemed like he might leave, but then we heard him laugh. A low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "You think that's gonna stop me?" he called out, his voice raspy and uneven. "You think spray is gonna save you?" "Leave us alone," Nate shouted, though I could hear the fear creeping into his voice. The man didn't respond. Instead, he disappeared into the trees, the darkness swallowing him whole. We stood there in silence, our flashlights darting around the woods, waiting for him to come back. Minutes felt like hours. "Maybe he's gone," Claire whispered, though she didn't sound convinced. "We can't stay here," Jared said. "We need to leave, now." "We can't hike out in the dark," Nate argued. "He'll pick us off one by one." "So what do we do?" Sam asked, his voice cracking. Nobody had an answer. We decided to build the fire back up, hoping it would keep him away. Nate and Jarrett stood guard with the bear spray and a hunting knife Jarrett had brought, while the rest of us gathered as much wood as we could find. The woods were silent except for the crackling fire and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But none of us relaxed. We knew he was still out there, watching, waiting. Around 4 a.m., just when we thought we might make it to sunrise, we heard the sound of footsteps again, this time coming from multiple directions. "Is there more than one?" Claire whispered, clutching my arm. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible. The footsteps got closer, circling the campsite. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They wanted us to know they were there. "Stay together," Nate said, his voice trembling. Suddenly, a rock flew out of the darkness, landing inches from the fire. Then another, and another. "Stop it," Nate shouted. "We'll call the cops." But they didn't stop. The rocks kept coming, some of them hitting the tents, one even knocking over a lantern. We huddled closer to the fire, our flashlights darting around wildly. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. "I think they're gone," Sam said. But before he could finish, the man from before lunged out of the darkness, swinging his knife. The man charged straight at us, his knife gleaming in the firelight. Nate reacted first, spraying the bear spray directly at his face. The man let out an animalistic scream, stumbling backward and clawing at his eyes, but he didn't drop the knife. "Run!" Nate yelled, grabbing a burning log from the fire as a weapon. We didn't need to be told twice. Claire grabbed my arm and we bolted toward the trail, the others right behind us. My legs felt like jelly, but the adrenaline kept me moving. Behind us, I could hear the man's furious screams and the sound of branches snapping as he chased us. The trail was barely visible in the dark, even with our flashlights. I tripped over roots and rocks, almost falling several times. Claire was sobbing, and I could hear Sam gasping for breath, but nobody stopped. "He's still coming!" Jared shouted from the back of the group. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him, stumbling but relentless, his knife still in hand. He was wheezing, his face red and swollen from the bear spray, but it didn't slow him down. "Keep going," Nate yelled. We reached a fork in the trail and hesitated, unsure which way to go. "Left," Nate shouted, taking the lead. We followed, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were about to give out, but the sound of the man's footsteps kept me moving. Suddenly, Sam tripped and fell hard, crying out as he hit the ground. "Help me!" he screamed. Nate and I skidded to a stop and turned back. The man was almost on top of him, his knife raised. Without thinking, Nate swung the burning log at the man, hitting him square in the chest. The man staggered back, his shirt catching fire. He dropped the knife, frantically trying to pat out the flames. I grabbed Sam under the arms and dragged him to his feet. "Go, go, go," Nate shouted. We didn't stop running until we saw the faint glow of the trailhead parking lot through the trees. I'd never been so relieved in my life. When we reached the lot, we collapsed against the car, gasping for breath. Claire fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unlock the doors. "Is he still coming?" Jared asked, his voice trembling. I turned and scanned the trail, but there was no sign of him. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound our ragged breathing. We piled into the car and sped off, leaving everything behind. Tents, gear, everything. Nobody spoke on the drive back. We were too shaken to even process what had happened. We reported the incident to the police the next day, but they didn't seem to take us seriously. They said it was probably a drifter or a squatter, and assured us that they'd send someone to check the area. I don't know if they ever found him. I still think about that night all the time. I can't sleep in the dark anymore, and I haven't been camping since. Every time I hear footsteps behind me, even in broad daylight, my heart races. The scariest part? He wasn't some supernatural monster or ghost. He was just a man, a real flesh and blood human being. and that makes it so much worse. Camping has always been my way of pressing the reset button on life. It's my escape from the noise of the world, the constant buzz of notifications, the deadlines, and the endless grind. I thought I knew what I was doing. I'd been on dozens of solo trips before. But nothing prepares you for what happens when that sense of peace you're searching for turns into a nightmare. This happened last summer. I'd just wrapped up a brutal quarter of work, and I was completely burned out. I needed to clear my head, so I packed my gear, jumped in my car, and headed out to Lassen National Forest in Northern California. It's a beautiful place. Miles of trails winding through dense forest, volcanic landscapes, and pristine lakes. Perfect for getting lost in nature without actually getting lost, if you know what I mean. I got to the trailhead in the early afternoon. It wasn't crowded, just a couple of cars parked there, and I felt that familiar sense of freedom as I started hiking. I didn't plan on going far, just far enough to feel like I was in my own little corner of the world. After about 1.5 miles, I found this spot. A small clearing surrounded by trees, with just enough sunlight filtering through to make it feel welcoming. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and spent the evening relaxing. I cooked some dehydrated meal I'd brought, drank a couple of beers, and just sat there, watching the sky turn from blue to orange to this deep, inky black. The stars out there are incredible. No city lights to mess with them. It's the kind of view that makes you feel small in the best way. By the time I climbed into my tent, I felt good, really good. The sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, were soothing. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. At first, I wasn't sure why I was awake. I lay there for a minute, groggy and disoriented, listening. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human ones. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves just outside my tent. My heart started racing. I froze, straining to hear. For a second, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the wind. But then I saw the light. A flashlight beam swept across the walls of my tent, casting these weird, distorted shadows. It wasn't just a quick pass. It lingered, moving up and down, side to side, like whoever was holding it was checking the tent out. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was maybe it was another camper, but why would they be wandering around my campsite in the middle of the night, and why weren't they saying anything? I lay there, holding my breath, hoping they'd just move on. But they didn't. The light stopped, aimed directly at my tent. I could see the shadow of a person, the outline of their legs through the thin fabric. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely think straight. I reached for the trekking pole I'd left next to my sleeping bag, gripping it tight. It was the only thing I had that could double as a weapon. Then I heard it, the sound of someone unzipping a jacket, followed by the faint jingle of keys or metal. My stomach twisted. It was such a specific sound, and it told me this person wasn't just passing by. They were preparing to do something. The flashlight clicked off, plunging everything into darkness. That's when I heard the tearing sound, the unmistakable rip of fabric. They were cutting into my tent. Panic took over. Without thinking, I yelled as loud as I could and swung the trekking pole toward the sound. It hit something solid, an arm maybe, or a shoulder, and the person let out this low guttural grunt. Then they ran, I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, the sound fading as they got farther and farther away. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat there in the dark, gripping the trekking pole, my ears straining for any sound that might mean they were coming back. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up my gear and got out of there. I didn't even bother cooking breakfast. I just shoved everything into my pack and practically jogged back to the trailhead. I reported it to the park rangers, but they didn't seem overly concerned. One of them said it was probably some drunk hiker messing around. I wanted to believe that, but it didn't sit right with me. Drunk hikers don't carry knives and start slashing tents. I haven't been camping since. I want to go back someday. I miss the peace, the simplicity of being out there. But every time I think about it, I see that flashlight beam and hear the sound of my tent ripping open. And I can't shake the feeling that if I hadn't fought back, I might not be here to tell this story. I've always loved camping, and I've done it alone plenty of times before. It's peaceful. It's freeing. There's something about being out in nature, away from all the noise of daily life, that makes me feel calm. I've camped all over California, from the beaches to the mountains to the dense woods. But I'll never forget the night I went camping near a remote area in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was early fall, the leaves just starting to turn, and I decided to take a trip to get some fresh air. I had my tent, my gear, and I was excited to spend the night out in the wilderness. I chose a spot deep enough in the woods where I knew I wouldn't be bothered. It was a little bit of a hike to get there, but I didn't mind. I was used to walking long distances. That evening, everything was going fine. The weather was perfect. The sky was clear. The temperature was just right. Not too cold, but cool enough that the campfire felt comforting. I got the fire going, roasted a few marshmallows, and just sat there, enjoying the peace. There were no other campers in sight. It was just me and the forest. As night started to fall, I began to feel a little more isolated. That's the thing about being in the wilderness. Even when you're alone, you can't shake the feeling that something's always watching you. But I didn't think much of it. I've been alone in the woods plenty of times before. I was used to the quiet, to the feeling of being small in the vastness of nature. But then, something caught my eye. I was sitting by the fire, just staring into the flames, when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my eyes were adjusting to the darkness. But when I looked again, I realized there was a figure standing at the edge of my campsite. Not moving, just standing still, at the farthest edge of the clearing. My heart skipped a beat. I could barely make out his shape in the darkness, but there was no mistaking that he was a man. Tall, with a scruffy beard, wearing a jacket and jeans, but no sign of a backpack or camping gear. Just standing there. I tried to brush it off at first. Maybe he was just another hiker passing by. The thought made sense. After all, this was a public campground, even if it was a little remote. But then I realized something. He wasn't moving. He wasn't walking or doing anything. He was just standing there, staring into the woods. It felt like hours had passed, but when I checked the time, only 5 minutes had gone by. 5 minutes of standing completely still, not a single sound, I called out to him, trying to sound casual, trying not to let my voice betray how uncomfortable I was. "Hey, you need something?" No response. Not a word, not even a slight movement. He was still just standing there, like he hadn't even heard me. My stomach twisted. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he couldn't hear me. Maybe he didn't want to talk. But something didn't sit right with me. I decided to try again. "Are you okay?" I asked, a little louder this time. Still, no answer. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, as if he was watching something far beyond my campsite. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. Why was he standing there? What was he waiting for? It was like he had no intention of moving, no intention of acknowledging me. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward him, hoping the light would break whatever spell he was under. He didn't even react to it. I was starting to feel uneasy. My heart was pounding in my chest. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to overreact, but I also didn't want to ignore the gut feeling telling me something was wrong. I grabbed my camping knife from the side of my bag just in case. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I couldn't keep staring at him. It was too unsettling. So I decided to retreat into my tent, hoping that if I just ignored it, he'd leave. I zipped myself into the tent, trying to calm my nerves. But that's when things started to get worse. From inside the tent, I could still see the dim glow of the campfire flickering outside. And then I heard it. The crunch of leaves. Slowly at first, then louder. Someone was moving toward my tent. My pulse quickened. I was trapped inside. There was nowhere to go. I couldn't just call for help. There was no self-service here. No one would hear me. I held my breath, hoping it was just the wind or some animal passing through. But then I heard it again. A soft, deliberate step on the dry leaves, followed by another. And another. Couldn't tell how close he was. It could have been 20 feet or 2. My flashlight was beside me, and I gripped it in my hand, ready to use it if I had to. The sound of footsteps stopped just outside my tent. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I heard a low voice, barely a whisper, but enough for me to hear clearly. "Hey," the man said. "Are you alone?" I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't let him know how scared I was. He didn't say anything else for a moment, but then I heard him moving around the tent, slowly, like he was circling it. My eyes darted around, trying to find an escape, but there was nothing. He was blocking the only exit. Then, without warning, I felt a tug on the corner of the tent. He was pulling at it, trying to unzip it. I felt the weight of his hand pressing against the fabric. My mind was screaming at me to do something. Anything. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it as hard as I could at the corner where I thought his hand was. The metal struck something solid, and I heard a grunt from outside. The tent shook, but I didn't stop. I kept swinging, hitting whatever part of him I could reach. After what felt like an eternity, the pulling stopped. I heard him curse under his breath, and then the sound of footsteps retreating. I didn't dare move for what seemed like forever. I stayed frozen in the tent, listening, waiting for any sign of him coming back. But eventually, the night grew quiet again. I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion because I woke up the next morning with the sun rising in the sky. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and hiked out of there, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. I didn't care about the beautiful view or the peace of the wilderness anymore. I was just glad to be leaving. When I got back to my car, I noticed a ranger nearby. I told him what had happened, and he listened carefully, nodding. It turns out there had been reports of a man lurking around that area, targeting solo campers. The ranger said they'd been trying to catch him for weeks. The man was found later that day, hiding in the woods. He was arrested and confessed to targeting lone campers. He said he liked the feeling of control, the thrill of waiting, watching, and finally approaching someone when they were most vulnerable. I've never camped alone since then. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I needed a break. Life had been too much. Work stress, constant noise, and never-ending deadlines. So, I packed up my gear, drove a few hours north from Sacramento, and set up camp in a secluded area of the Sierra Nevada mountains. This wasn't my first solo camping trip, but it was by far the most remote I'd ever been. There were no campgrounds, no other campers around, just me and nature. The sky was clear when I set up my tent. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional call of a bird were the only things I could hear. It felt good to be away from everything. After a small fire to cook a quick meal, I made myself comfortable in the tent, zipped up tight, and tried to read a little before falling asleep. I thought about the quiet, thought about the solitude. Night settled in and the temperature dropped quickly, forcing me to zip my jacket tight around me. I had planned to sleep early, waking up for a hike at dawn, but as the night deepened, I started hearing things. At first it wasn't much, just a rustle, like a small animal in the bushes nearby. I've camped enough to know that sounds like that are normal. It could have been a raccoon or a deer. I tried not to let it bother me. But then the noises started getting closer. I stayed still, trying to focus on the crackling of the fire outside and not the rustling that was growing louder. It was coming from just outside my tent. It wasn't an animal anymore. The noise had a rhythm, like someone was circling the tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, pulled the sleeping bag tighter around myself, holding my breath, hoping the noise would go away. But it didn't. My heart started to race. It could still be an animal, I tried to convince myself. But then the footsteps came. Slow, heavy steps, moving back and forth outside the tent. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or not, but my instincts screamed that something wasn't right. The worst sound though was the zipper. At first it was soft. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, but then I heard it again. A faint click of the zipper being pulled. I immediately froze, my mind scrambling. I grabbed my flashlight from the side of the tent, my fingers shaking as I clicked it on. The light flickered for a second and then illuminated the inside of the tent. I didn't dare peek outside. I kept the flashlight aimed at the walls, praying the person, or whatever it was, would just leave. But then, the zipper slid down again. This time it was deliberate. It was slow, and it was too quiet. The man, or whoever it was, wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to get in. I held my breath. The flashlight felt like a worthless comfort now. I heard his breathing, low and steady, and then the silhouette of a man appeared in the entrance, just outside my tent. I couldn't see his face at first, but I could see his figure through the thin fabric. He was standing there, motionless. I could feel his eyes on me. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew he wasn't there for anything good. Panic surged through me. Should I scream? Should I make a run for it? But if I screamed, he might come in faster. And if I ran, I didn't know if I could outrun him in the dark. Then I saw something glinting in his hand. A knife. The reflection of the moonlight off its blade sent a chill through me. I backed up in the tent, my mind racing. I had a small pocket knife, but it felt useless compared to his. I couldn't just sit there and wait for him to come in. My survival instincts kicked in. I reached for the edge of the tent, the flaps still halfway open. I had to get out. I wasn't going to sit there and let him get any closer. I had to act fast. I quietly unzipped the back of the tent, silently, praying the man wouldn't hear. As I crouched low to the ground, I heard his voice. It was soft, barely a whisper, but I could make out the words. "You don't need to run." I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted into the darkness of the forest, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I could hear his footsteps behind me, close, but not close enough. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath ragged and sharp as I pushed through the dense underbrush, blindly running deeper into the woods. I couldn't tell if he was following. I didn't dare look back. My only focus was getting away. I couldn't stop, couldn't let him catch me. I found a tree large enough to hide behind and crouched down, trying to control my breathing. I stayed there, trembling, listening for any sound. The only thing I could hear was my own panicked breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. Then, silence, complete silence. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, too scared to move. I heard nothing, no footsteps, no voice, no movement. I didn't know if he had left or was still waiting, watching for me to make a mistake. The first light of dawn began to break through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I knew I had to get out of there. I waited just a little longer, too afraid to move, until the sun was up enough to offer some safety. I eventually made my way to the nearest ranger station. I was shaking, my legs weak, my mind spinning with disbelief. The rangers were kind but concerned. They listened carefully to my story, their expressions serious. They sent a team to check the area. When they came back, the rangers were grim. They found signs of someone having been in the area all night. Footprints around my tent, broken branches, and evidence that whoever had been stalking me had been watching for hours. But the man was gone. They couldn't track him down. The only thing they could do was offer to escort me back to my car. I've never been able to forget that night. The terror of hearing that man's breath just outside my tent, knowing that I was helpless, knowing that he was so close to getting in. I haven't gone camping alone since, and I never will again. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.